zoom people out a little bit. This is a business question first. It's not necessarily about which features, just enough information to know the likely outcome.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our third AMA. Today we are covering the topic of justifying tech spend. I'm your host, Mike Almeida. I'm here with my business partner, Mark Gibson. And as we dive into today's topic, there are a few things that really come to mind. When you think about technology spend, when we look at the big picture, oftentimes we're always operating from a place of making decisions from a backwards looking perspective instead of looking forwards. And when you think about spending money, and talking about technology, it's usually a myopic view. Most people tend to look at the cost in the moment of what is it going to pull out of my pocket from a business perspective, instead of looking at how it manifests over a period of time. And because of that, the costs associated with this spend are often viewed in a vacuum instead of being zoomed out. And you don't really make the spend because you can't define ROI. ROI is different for different people, but when you're having a knee-jerk reaction in terms of purchasing technology, it's very hard for you not only to determine what the ROI is, but how does it impact your business? Big problem. And business owners, what they are great at doing is recognizing the problem, but what they fail to do is quite put their finger on where it's manifesting in the business. And when you don't know how to effectively run a business when it comes to making cost, it usually clouds your viewpoint of the situation. You might overspend in one area, you might underspend in another area. And really at the end of the day, you're looking at your whole entire budget and you're like, how can I spend money on technology when my money's consumed everywhere? I don't see it. So now begs the question, how do I even justify spending more on technology? And with that question, I'm going to pass it to you, Mark.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, right, Mike? That question, particularly, as you're making recommendations, you're having conversations with, small business owners. That's the sort of the pressure they're feeling. The reality is, though, that sometimes you just can't. You can't justify spending the money on the technology. But to your point a little bit earlier, it's maybe why can't you do that? And that's more of a business question than it is a technology question. When we start to talk about spending on technology, there's this question, this classification of, is this more of an expense question or an expense spend or an investment? If you look at it in terms of expenses are a little bit more just cost of doing business, right? They're short term, a little smaller. Hey, I can't practically accomplish what I'm trying to do without, that spend. Whereas an investment is, it's a little bit more longer term. It's higher dollar usually. It's got more moving parts. There's some steps between the spend and the payoff, but it's about advancing your business. It's about moving it forward. And so, as a small business owner, you get 100 things coming at you, right? So how do you sort of separate the signal from the noise on all of that to really understand, does this, technology spend make sense? And so often what happens is that technology request or recommendation is coming up through the IT team, right? IT team has a perspective of, hey, maybe it's a series of support tickets, maybe it's an audit that revealed some sort of risk, whatever the case might be, but they're trying to shoehorn their recommendation into the larger equation of everything that you have going on at the business. And a lot of times they don't have that perspective. And so it comes to you in a little bit of an isolation, and, it depends on how well your process is set up for how does that request fit into my larger initiatives. And so what we always try to do is zoom people out a little bit. Because, again, like I said, this is a business question first before it's an IT question. And as a business question, you're looking at a different set of variables. It's not necessarily about which features, or how it's supported or all the things you go through in business requirements. It's a little bit more about the idea that we don't have, 10K for an investment sitting over in the corner. When we invest that 10,000 in some sort of IT thing, it's where are we pulling it from? which trade-off are we making within the business? And for a lot of small business owners, the command of their business, the picture of their business is based on their accounting reports, right? Of which are generally, they're a reactive model. They certainly serve their purpose from a tax mitigation and reporting perspective, but they're hard to use to make a decision that is going to go forward because you don't have necessarily the right information to kind of translate that. So what we have done is sort of built this model that helps you understand there's really only four places money goes in the business, right? It comes in as revenue for most of us. I'm excluding, capital investments and so forth. So, revenue comes in and then you spend it to sell stuff, you spend it to deliver stuff, and then you spend it to manage your risk. And whatever's left over is cash. That's the four buckets of where your money goes. IT typically falls into that risk category. However, for most small businesses, the way they look at this, right, they've got a good idea about their revenue, and they've got a good idea about what's coming out on the other side. But there's a big black box that they aren't necessarily set up to know where, the decision points are being made in terms of money on a, monthly, quarterly basis. And so it's hard to know which levers you can pull, which trade-offs you can make, how you can map those spends to those priorities. And so when you're looking at your spending, by default, small businesses, they prioritize their delivery because that's what they know, that's how they started. And without, the right data, they're probably going to overspend on their delivery because that's where the comfort level is. But that puts pressure on the rest of the business in terms of being able to invest in growth and risk. And then of course it also puts pressure on, the cash payouts that come from there. So that's the challenge when you're sitting there going, hey, how do I look at this? How do I look at this IT request? That's the big bucket it's falling into. You processed all of that, not necessarily even formally, but it's how you feel. The emotion of this always comes in, and trying to pull it apart a little bit is challenging.
So, Mark, you're the point I heard you make here is that most business owners look at their business from a very, you said accounting point of view, right? So, is there a different way that business owners should be looking at their business to help them avoid what you just said?
Well, I don't know if it'll help them avoid, but it'll certainly make them aware, right? I mean, that's the point, is to be cognizant of where you're choosing to put your investments, your resources. And what we've done for us, and this is how we help, our clients to do it as well, is we've essentially developed a model that kind of pulls that back. If you don't need to wait for your accounting reports to be able to make decisions on those plans. You've got to be able to make it a little bit faster. You don't need all the information. You need enough information. And so if you begin to think about, just kind of projecting out a little bit, again, it's the idea of revenue, and then it's going to go in four places. Where do I want that money to go as a business? How do I plan for it? And then, what's your strategic planning process in terms of how you kind of look at the next year? And so, we as small business owners ourselves sort of struggled to find something that helped us with that, and we developed our own stuff over the years. So, kind of that's what I think we should talk about today. Is I'll share sort of a sample model that we have that categorizes this stuff for us, and it structures the data for us in a way that helps us have clarity about where the money's going. And so there's a cash equation that governs all of this, which is kind of what we just talked about, right? Which is this top level here, that revenue is the money coming in. From that money, you're going to have your cost of selling your service. You're going to have the cost of delivering your service. And after that, that's your profit. Profit on paper. It's not overly complicated in terms of like net profit, gross profit, other diversion profits that you're going to really digest in your accounting model. And it's intentionally simple. This needs to be functional in a way that allows you to digest and process the information quickly so that you can make a decision and move on. So from your profit, though, you've still got one more category, which is that profit of managing risk. The way we define risk and the way we look at it, and I think everyone should look at it this way, profit's on paper, right? That's what you'll see in your reports. But what you really want is cash in the bank. And risk is what separates the profit on paper from the cash in the bank. So anything that's a cost for risk, there is what we put that. And that's where we typically would account for HR, finance, legal, IT, back end or sort of office operations. Anything that's going to come out of this profit number is going to be in that category. So again, this is sort of where IT lives sometimes. And I say sometimes because, as we're going to talk about a little bit, IT can really be accounted for in any one of these areas, because that's the nature of technology in 2025, is that it serves different functions. It's no longer the IT team is an isolated cost that is in a group. It is so integrated into what you do day in and day out that really something like buying a new CRM shouldn't be considered an IT cost. It should be considered a cost of selling.
Very interesting. And so, looking at this model, I'd like to imagine that it appears that you can probably measure the impact of a technology decision because you now know where it's coming from or what function of the business it's coming. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. So this is, I describe this as sort of a multifaceted tool here, right? I mean, we're talking about it in a little bit narrow focus in terms of how to evaluate IT spends. But it's really, as you can see here, I mean, this is a very basic spreadsheet, right? This is not super software polish driven stuff. You can put it together in a spreadsheet as long as you have the logic on it. But what we've looked at, is, hey, this is, this sample company, 2024, they finished at 2 million in revenue. 2025, they're saying, hey, we want to generate 10% more revenue. So the question becomes, cool, we know in 2024 we were an organization that generated $2 million of revenue. It took us this much to sell it, this much to deliver it. We had this kind of risk cost, and it generated 7%, on the cash. That's sort of the output of it. We want to be an organization that does what in 2025? And in this case, what we're saying is we picked a target of 2.2 million. We want 10% growth on that revenue. We want to increase our cash percentage as much as we could. And we want to do that without increasing our staff costs. We want to be able to generate the same amount of revenue with the same amount of cost. So if we start there with a projection, it becomes, what are the things we need to do in 2025 that can help us achieve that difference? Technology plays a role in almost all of those initiatives, but it's not always recognized as anything other than an IT spend. And so, if you think about kind of the outcomes you're looking to achieve, and these are kind of, these are mapped by a category, even just the idea of implementing a new CRM, I don't know what the cost off the top of the head, it might be 5-10K, right? But as an organization, what we said was we generated 135K in cash last year. We want to generate our target of 250K. That's where you got to start, right? Is to say, what do we need the cash to be? Well, that's improving by almost double, but we're talking about a 10% increase in revenue, but almost all of that's falling to the bottom line in this current projection. What you can use is this delta, right, between the 365 and the 250. That becomes the cash you can use to fund the initiatives that you choose to implement for 2025. No small business is going to say, hey, in 1 year, I want to try to tackle all these things, right? I just kind of put those on there for demonstration or visualization. But when you start to ask about an IT spend, the decisions about how much you're going to spend in 2025 should really already have been baked in as a part of your planning process that you did in October, November 24. If you didn't do it, you can pick it up whenever it happens. But the reality is you need to have a higher level, broader, view of where money is going and how that attaches to your results before you can make a true assessment of whether or not the IT spend makes sense. Like you were talking about it in the initial description there. The variables that you consider typically are, hey, I have this much money before, and I have this much less money after. That's not really the criteria that you should be using to determine whether or not you make an investment in the business. What you should do is say, hey, can I take this and map it to, like we've talked about, a result somewhere else in the business? And with technology, you can map it to many, many places.
So, Mark, I want to ask this question here because a lot of times businesses tend to focus on the revenue number, but what I heard you say was you need to start with the cash number. Why do we start with the cash number and evaluating all this to begin with?
I would tell you that from my perspective, that cash number is really the only reason the business exists, right? Is to generate cash. Nobody is trying to do more work for no money. So as a business owner, you start that business, and there's a lot of reasons that's not just about making money, but everybody needs to make some money, as they're doing it. So, there's a whole nother conversation that's not this about what do you do with that cash afterwards, right? That's a financial planning conversation, so on and so forth. But achieving those goals, maybe as an individual or as a small group of business owners, or even as a team, how much you can invest in your business is dictated by how much cash it generates. So that's where you start there, right? You understand what you want to do, and you get the cash piece. So once you have that cash, then you can kind of work backwards to say, how hard do we have to work to be able to generate that much cash? And of course, revenue doesn't dictate how much cash you make. Margins do. All right. And so we often lose sight, small business owners as a whole often lose sight of the idea that all revenue is not good revenue, and trying to maintain discipline to that. So what ends up happening is become a low margin business unintentionally. And as a low margin business, you focus first and foremost on delivery, like we were talking about earlier, right? I focus on delivery first, risk second. Then I focus on growth. Then I focus on the cash number. Well, if you do it in that order, when you don't have enough margins, you tend to, risk gets sort of carved up into almost reactive cost and proactive cost. There's no proactive cost. We don't invest in that. There's no growth in terms of sales. We don't invest in that. And then there's certainly no cash left over, for growth, or not necessarily growth, but development of the business, or even personal compensation for the ownership team. So delivery becomes an outsized cost for your organization, but you don't have visibility to that. Like, again, you can look at a P&L and you can kind of get there, but there's a lot of steps between here and there. And again, that's also going to be something that you are doing reactively. Putting together a model of this and kind of populating it, once a month gives you some idea of where you're headed, and you can react more quickly to those things that give you an opportunity to be able to spend on managing your risk proactively, which is, again, somewhere where that IT investment comes in as well.
So in looking at the sheet, obviously you mentioned you've got a target of an increase of revenue. You have a $250,000 cash target. How do the initiatives and outcomes? Because I'm in my mind as I'm looking at this, I'm actually saying these sure look like ways to justify investing in the business. So can you talk a little bit about how the initiatives and outcomes influence that decision process, perhaps?
Well, that goes back to the strategic planning, right? I mean, when you are taking a longer view of your business, hopefully you're doing something 1 year at a minimum, maybe 3-5 years, whatever your process looks like. But those numbers, you're describing, or you're setting a vision for yourself of, here's who we want to be as an organization. Here's who we want to be at the end of 2025. Comparing that against who you are at the end of 2024, and what's the delta? How do we close that gap? And that's what sort of the initiatives are for, is the idea of what are the steps we have to take to improve ourselves beyond that. I mean, when you think about sort sort of that expense versus investment classification, or whatever. Your expense piece is really just how do I keep my head above water. It's just how do I survive. The investment piece is about how do I thrive. So that's how I would kind of map it and look at it.
Interesting. So, I mean, this is a really, it seems to be a very impactful model for any type of small business owner. So, ultimately, when you think about, Mark, we talked about justifying IT spend. You said earlier sometimes you can't. How does this model sort of influence the way we look at it in our business? How does this help small business owners? What should be their takeaway from this? What's the solution for them?
I think first and foremost, you've got to get, whether it's this model or something similar, you've got to have a way to have command of your business. It can't be like, I do not discount the impact or influence or value of gut instinct. But gut instinct is limited. It should inform your decisions, but it's not the only thing that you should do it. And so, getting a model you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with carving up an accounting piece and using that for projections and so forth, you can do that. But you got to have something that again, everybody talks about data-driven decisions. I don't think you have to be a slave to the data, but you got to be aware of it. It has to be a data point for you, in terms of how you make your decision. So that's the first thing. The second thing is really going to be some type of process that allows you to see beyond the day-to-day. Again, a planning process, a strategy piece. If you work with somebody, great. If you don't, that's okay too, but you still got to have time for yourself to be able to do some deep thinking, to be able to plan that out. If you don't have that, you are constantly going to be at the mercy of whatever's happening within your business. And, knowing the numbers will be great, but you're not going to be able to make any decisions to change it. So those two things are what I would say are necessary. If you're in a place where you're struggling to, justify IT spends, here's what I'll tell you. Any healthy small business should be able to invest regularly. Like, it's not infinite resources, right? But they should be able to invest regularly in not just their IT, any of their risk functions. So again, it could be legal, HR, finance. Those things should all be something they could invest in. They should also be able to invest in growing their business, from a sales perspective. But that doesn't mean, normally when you talk about this IT recommendation, what you hear is, hey, I want you to spend $10,000. And what's heard is, oh, well, I have to take that off the back end of what I'm pulling out of the business, from a cash perspective. That's not an either or situation. Sometimes you invest in IT, sometimes you invest in finance, sometimes you invest in sales, but that's all the give and take of your strategic planning process that sort of lays the groundwork for you to be able to make those decisions more easily and effectively during the year when they're coming up.
Interesting. So at the end of the day, Mark, when I hear, I think I heard you say there's sort of an accounting model. There's sort of, I'm going to call it, for lack of better terms, sort of an operational model. How can we as small business owners get our mindsets to start to adjust to going from accounting, which I think you heard you say helps you with tax mitigation, other strategies, to more of this operational piece that helps you look at things from a futuristic standpoint or a look forward standpoint? What are some things that we can do as small business owners to start to adjust our mindset that way?
I think, we talked previously about sort of how you make decisions, as a person in your life is exactly how you make decisions about IT and within your business as well. And that's there's truth to that. I mean, obviously. And so what I guess I would say is, if you are someone who needs to have all the information to make a decision, you gotta help your business account for that, adjust for that, because the only way this is going to work is if you are able, as a business, to make a decision that again, doesn't have all the information, but has enough information. And so it's, the more we talk about this, the more that I keep coming back to the idea that the business and the owner are two different entities, and they have different needs, right? And so you as a business owner or as an individual can afford to be a little bit more reactive, make decisions after the fact because it doesn't have as much impact. Your business will be limited by that if that's the only way the business makes the decision. So you got to get comfortable with making some decisions with maybe 70% of the information, just enough information to know the likely outcome. You're never going to know 100% of it, or if you do, you probably lost the opportunity to exploit the advantage of whatever's coming. And really, I think that's probably the first thing I would tell you. After that, it just, again, the numbers are probably already there. You just got to change how you look at them. That's really what's happening.
So coming away from today's AMA as we wrap up here, what would you tell a small business owner who's, or at least somebody who's getting ready to start their business and has aspirations to do great things, thinks of technology, thinks of all these different things? What would you tell a brand new business owner getting ready to get started? If you could go back in time and start your business differently or have this approach, what would you advise to that brand new business owner who might be in their first, maybe second year business?
Make sure to take a broad view of what's happening. Even though, and frankly, as you start your business, there's probably a lot of things you can't afford, right? But just because you can't afford them doesn't mean you should ignore them. You should be aware of those things so that as you grow, again, we talked about this order that you typically invest in, or small business typically invest in, is sort of deliver, then risk, then sell, then cash. I think you've got to flip that a little bit. Really, likely sell is where you need to invest to begin with. Which is only sort of kind of related to, the IT conversation, but just as a general business philosophy, you've got to be able to sell your product, then you've got to be able to deliver your product. And that's why we built the equation the way we did, right? Those are the first two things. You don't even worry about the risk piece until you're generating some sort of profit, because you got to have something valuable to protect, right? So, again, try to be aware of the entire picture for your business, because even when you're small with one person starting out, you still have all the other needs. Your needs change, they grow, they shift priorities, but they're still there. And you as the leader of that business have to be aware of it and figure out, you need to intentionally address or ignore particular things, but you can't do that without understanding what they are and where they fit in.
Excellent points. Mark, I really appreciate your insight here. I think this is a powerful teaching and discussion for people that are been in business for 20 years or you're just getting started. So I thank you for the content, for sharing the model that we use at D3, and also providing great thought leadership on the topic. So as always, if you enjoyed today's conversation and AMA, please make sure to go to our YouTube channel, hit like and subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when we have our next AMA. And so if you enjoyed it, please let us know, and please join us next month. We meet noon, the last Friday of every month. So Mark, again, thanks for your time today, my friend, and see you next month. Take care.
Thanks.